participants of this FDP program. And today I'm going to talk about the architecture and interfaces of IoT. Because itself is a vast topic, and there are so many types of sensors. And rather than concentrating more on the sensor part, because what you are going to use possibly would depend upon what application you are going to use. I would rather concentrate on the interfaces because they are going to be common, and many of these sensors will finally end up transferring data over these interfaces. So this is the agenda. Mm, After the introduction, we will look at some of the serial interfaces like UART, I2C, SPI, and CAN, and of course Ethernet, which is slightly different. Then I will briefly touch upon the various sensors that are typically used, and then we will end up with a summary. So I will start off from where what Professor Sharad had shown yesterday. He had shown an echo dot, and he had also shown that what's inside that. So now here, let me just turn on the. All right. So this is the echo dot as it looks from outside, and then internally, if you try to see what is inside that, you will find that it has got a few chips, some sensors, and one of them is a microcontroller and some wireless controller, etc. So that is inside this. So these chips that are shown here are, some of them are connected using the kind of buses that I am going to describe. So if you look at the overall architecture of IoT, there is a three-layer architecture, there is a five-layer architecture. So various books give the various types of architectures, but the perception layer is common. So this perception layer has sensors and all the embedded hardware that either generates the data, or if there are actuators, then they interpret the data and take appropriate action. So we would be concentrating on this layer, and in this layer lies the sensors and the associated hardwares and communication methods that are used to transfer the data which is gathered by the sensor. So this is another view of what is inside that ARM chip that's used by Raspberry Pi. So you are going to, I saw that, I noticed that in the subsequent lectures, you are going to have a demonstration come hands-on on using Raspberry Pi. So Raspberry Pi uses an ARM-based Cortex A72 based chip that's from Broadcom called BCM2711. And why I am showing this is you will find that inside this you have what I described in my agenda. Uh, all those interfaces like Gigabit Ethernet, UART, SPI, I2C. CAN is not here, but you may use it in some other application. So these appear like BCM2711 is a SoC which has got here you see the main CPU. It has got a video engine and two HDMI ports, all that. But they on the another side, it has got all the I/O interfaces, which the important ones which we are going to describe. I have uh, I have put them as a highlighted them in this slide. So this is where this is the position at which you will find that these interfaces exist. But if you are going to use these interfaces through programming, then you are going to interact with these interfaces through device drivers. And as you know, device drivers use calls like open, close, read, write, etc. So in that sense, a programmer is insulated from knowing the registers and the intricacies of these ports, but it's always useful to know how these ports work. Another thing is that the nodes in an IoT architecture, uh, they, in my opinion, are of two types. One, the more powerful ones, which do the number crunching and data processing, and the other ones are the ones which are the edge, as was mentioned yesterday. So these nodes which are on the edge typically are either the source or sink of information that flows in an IoT architecture. The sensors by themselves will generate information in some form. Let's say uh, a temperature sensor may convert the temperature that it is sensing into a voltage level, or a pressure sensor may convert the pressure that it is sensing into a current which is sensed by a loop. So these are analog quantities. But finally, when you are going to transmit this data, this will have to be converted into a digital form, and there will be some hardware around that sensor which will typically convert it into a digital form and then transmit uh, over the IoT framework to reach its destination. So my focus will be on describing how these interfaces are, and these interfaces will help in transferring the data from where it is generated to another hop from where it can go into the IoT framework. So we will begin with the UART, the serial communication. So traditionally, when you say serial communication, you are essentially having a single line with reference to a reference voltage, let's say a TX as a line, that is transmit line. Along with ground, it will allow the voltages on that line to change. So these data bits are present in turn, means you will send LSB, let's say LSB 0, LSB 1, LSB 2, and finally the eighth bit will be MSB. So you have a data byte which is 8 bits, but you have just one line. So you present it in turns, meaning over a scale of time, you send them one by one. So at the absolute minimum, suppose you want to connect two devices using a link, you will need a data line, and the voltage on the data line will be with reference to ground. So now when you are toggling this bit, series is sending them as a sequence. So you will have ones and zeros going over the link. You need to tell where does, what is the boundary of the bit, meaning where does one bit end and where does the next bit start. So this we called as a bit boundary. Now a group of such bits, like suppose in simplest form, let us say that there are 8 group of bits which form a byte. Then how do you differentiate one byte from another? So first you have to differentiate, have a mechanism to differentiate an individual bit, and then group these bits together and differentiate this byte from a neighboring byte. So to make sure that such kind of information is communicated, uh, the serial communication is broadly divided into synchronous, as the name suggests, you will have a clock with it, or asynchronous, where the clock will not be present. In synchronous communication, the transmitter and the receiver, they share a clock signal. So typically, you will have a connection between a device, which is a transmitter, and another device, which is a receiver. They will definitely have a data line on which data is sent, and the ground that I mentioned in the previous slide. Additionally, it should also have a clock. So the clock will qualify the data. So when should the receiver sample the data, that will be decided by the rising edge of the clock. So I'm sure you can understand this, that the data is sent along with clock is sent, and it is guaranteed that the setup and hold times of the sampling will be with reference to the rising edge of the clock. As a result, the transmitter can change the data line anywhere between the rising edge, but make sure that before the edge rises for certain time called as setup time, a few nanoseconds, the data is stable, and post the rising edge, which is called as the hold time, again a few nanoseconds, the data is stable. After that, it can change. Here we are saying that there is no requirement to run the clock at fixed or steady frequency, though it's easier to make a clock run at a steady frequency, but some variations can be tolerated. The reason being that the clock is part of the interface. So the transmitter makes sure that at the rising edge of the clock, the data is stable and which is sampled by the receiver. In asynchronous communication, as the name suggests, there is no clock. So how does the receiver sample the data? So the data rate is prearranged, meaning here now remember that suppose we say that the baud rate is 9600. That means the clock period is 1 upon 9600. So approximately 0.1 milliseconds you can say. So this has to be very accurate because the clock is not going from the transmitter to the receiver. Hence, the receiver will have its own clock, transmitter will have its own clock, but the period at which the clock is changing is within the certain strict limits. So now when you are sending bits like this, you will also need what is called as a start bit. So the start bit indicates that Sharadji, are you trying to say anything? Okay, I hope that was just a disturbance and I can continue. So data is grouped in 10 or 11 bits. So what are this? What are the additional bits? So there is a start bit and there is a stop bit. So the 8 bits of data, they are encapsulated between a start bit and a stop bit, which we call it as a frame. And when the no data is being sent, the link will idle. We can say that the link idles in most of the cases at logic level 1. And then the start bit is indicated by a change from 1 to 0. So what is the receiver doing? The receiver is continuously sampling the idle link and it is continuously finding it to be 1. The moment the transmitter is ready, it will first send a start bit. So the link will change from 1 to 0. That is where the receiver recognizes. And then what it will do is it will wait for a half bit period. And then because it's a start bit, because it has to reach the center of the bit, so it will wait for half a bit and then sample in the subsequent middle of 8 data bits. After the 8 data bits are over, the 10th bit is stop bit, which will bring the link again to idle state from 0 to 1 and it will remain in 1. So in idle state, the link will remain at logic level 1 and whenever 8 bits have to be sent, first the start bit will be sent, then 8 bits will be sent and then the stop bit. This is how the asynchronous communication takes place. So now which one to choose among them if you have a choice? Because synchronous has a clock with it, the rate can be higher and you can design the synchronous communication for a higher speed, and the design of transmitter and receiver is simple because they are connected through a receiver. But the bad part of this is the clock has to be transmitted. We are used to sending clocks, drawing clocks as a sequence of ones and zeros where the waveform becomes 1 then becomes 0. So in practice it is not like that. There are interferences. As a result, the clock may get disturbed in the sense that the edges may not be sharp. And when you transmit over a long distance, the signal quality worsens. Thereby, the receiver is not able to extract clock properly. Therefore, if you are choosing synchronous communication, which is useful for sending data at a fast rate, it is limited by the distance. Whereas asynchronous ones, because there are overheads, start stop bits, and there is an idle period. If you want to send data sporadically, means chunk of data, then no data, then another chunk of data, then asynchronous is useful. Asynchronous has no option. You have no option but to use asynchronous if you are sending it over long distance. Okay? But then asynchronous is good for sporadic, but it is not good when large chunks of data has to be transferred. So you have to choose between synchronous and asynchronous based on what distance you want to spend, what is the speed at which you want to send. But the thumb rule says that longer distance, no choice but to go for asynchronous, but then the data rates are going to be limited. So what is the hardware that is used inside? Like you saw in the BCM2711, there was a UART. So now I'm not going to describe the UART of 2711, but I'm going to describe the very simple one which you used in an Atmel processor or a PIC processor, and it is a generic UART that I'm going to describe. So now what we said was that UART can be used for connecting two devices, one transmitter and one receiver. Both these devices have to use the same baud rate. So what is baud rate? Baud rate defines how many times a signal changes in a second. A typical baud rate is 9600, that is 96 bits per second. Many UARTs, apart from allowing 8-bit data, which is the actual data, they will also allow 9-bit. So what is the 9th bit? 9th bit is parity. What is parity used for? Parity used for checking. So if there is an interference in the transmission and there is an error because of which a 1 bit changes from 1 to 0 or 0 to 1, then the parity is going to give an error. Hence you need 9 data bits, and many UARTs, they allow parity to be added. Noise filtering, I will explain what it is, that is done at the receiver. Then there is something called as some errors that are detected. Overrun refers to a state wherein a data comes in and the data is not picked up. What will happen if data is not picked up? Another data can come in over the link. In such case, the error is called as overrun. Means previous data before being picked up by the CPU from the UART gets overwritten by another data that is coming from the other side. Framing error, I said frame consists of start bit, 8 data bit, stop bit, possibly a parity bit. If the last data bit is not sensed as stop bit, then it is a framing error. False data bit detection, I will explain that. If there is a glitch, actual data is not coming, just a glitch, it should not be treated as a start bit. So how that is done? In the previous session, interrupts were described. So interrupts are something that indicate completion of activity in this context. So whenever transmission, a byte was given, the byte got transmitted successfully, the UART can send the interrupt to the CPU. The UART was ready to receive a byte. 8 data bits came in, parity was checked, everything was all right. So RX complete. That's another way a UART can interrupt the CPU. So here I have shown a typical diagram of a UART's transmitter section. So how does transmission start? Transmission starts on, this is an internal data bus. On this data bus, a CPU is sitting, a microcontroller is sitting. That microcontroller sends data in the UART data register. Parallelly, 8-bit data comes in here. Then once this data is put in, it gets into a shift register. Why shift register is required? Because loading is parallel, whereas transmission is serial. So you need a mechanism by which the serial byte is converted into a, a set of bits which are sent one after another serially. So now there is a baud rate generator which gives the clock, and once the data is loaded, 10 bits, start bit, 8 data bit and stop bit, or 11 if a parity is also present. So it is shifted out, and once it is shifted out, there is a status register in which transmission complete flag is set, and that can generate a interrupt. So this is how the transmitter works. That is, parallel data is loaded by the CPU or the host or the microcontroller of which this UART is a part, and then once it is loaded, it is sent out bit by bit. A reverse of this happens at the receiver. The receiver, this is the pin through which the data comes in bit by bit. There is a data recovery logic. I will explain that in the next slide. And then the data comes in the shift register. When the entire 8 bits have appeared, the data is copied in the UART data register. So what is the CPU supposed to do? CPU is supposed to read this data. How will CPU know that the data has arrived? Because an interrupt will be generated after RX is complete. So all the 10 bits without any error, then there is no framing error or any such error, then the UART status register will indicate that RX complete and the interrupt can be generated if the programmer has so desired. So this is the receiver section. I talked about noise filtering. So how it is done? What I told you is that typically this is an idle. If the line is high, then we will say that the line is idle. Start bit is going from high to low. What is receiver doing? Receiver is continuously looking at this data line. At one point in time, it finds that the data line has gone low, indicating that it is a start bit. So it will wait for half a bit period. Here it will check whether the line is still low. If there was a glitch like this here, which went up again, then the start bit will be sensed as 1, which means it was a glitch and not really a start bit. But if it finds that continuously it is low and the middle bits are sample number 8, 9 and 10, if it finds that it is low, that means it's a valid start bit. And then after that it will wait for 1 bit period, which will bring it to the center of bit number D0 LSB like this. The bold lines that you see here are sample number 8, 9 and 10. Ideally, all of them should be 0 or 1. But if there is a noise, 2 of them will be 0 and 1 will be 1 or vice versa. So this is what is called as oversampling, and ideally it should sampling in the middle is good enough. But to make sure that glitches are taken care of multiple times, 3 times it is sensed, and thus it is found to be 1 or 0. So what does the programmer do? Programmer has got 3 registers through which he will access the UART. Typically, data register through which data is sent or received, status register in which he can check whether RX is complete, TX is complete. So suppose a previous data is given which is being transmitted, then till the TX becomes complete, and then unless that happens, the next data will not be loaded. Similarly, it is waiting for a byte to come. What will it check? It will check whether RX is complete. Only then this register will be read. So those details you will find in the datasheet of the particular UART. So UART is good for sending data serially, and it is a peripheral that is present in most of the microcontrollers. And using these 3 registers, the programmer can send and receive data. If you are doing assembly language or C language programming, through which you are directly accessing the UART. But as I mentioned, in cases like uh, Raspberry Pi, you are accessing these devices under the control of the operating system, in which case the interface is through what is called as a device driver. And device driver has got calls like open, close, set, IOCTL, open, etc. So if you are using it under an OS like Linux, then the device driver is the way. If you are using it on a, like Professor Sharad mentioned about Arduino, if you are using a serial port on an Arduino, you would be doing assembly language programming and using the registers to program. Now the levels on the UART, TX and RX, they are at 5 volt. But when you are transmitting the data at 50 feet, then in that case, you will be using an interface like RS-232. There are other interfaces like RS-422, RS-485, but I will explain just one such interface. So this is a very old interface. That was the time when the terminals were attached to mainframe computers using RS-232. It is an asynchronous full duplex voltage base. So here you see the levels. Idle period is called as, it's called as a mark, and it is logic level 1, but the voltages are this. When the logic level is 0, it is called as space, and these are the levels. So a typical transmission begins from the line going from idle state, this transmit side, to start bit, then 7 rather 8 bits of the byte to be sent and a stop bit. This is a typical transmission. So these are the signals. Typically in full duplex, this is the transmit signal. This is sorry, RxD is the receive signal, TXD is the transmit signal, and there is a ground. So voltages on TX and RX are with reference to ground. Now in the old days, the RS-232 was used for connecting modems. Modem is modulator demodulator, which allows the telephone line to be used for sending and receiving data. So in that, there used to be modem control signals called DSR, DTR, DCD. So if you are using the if you are using the UART of Raspberry Pi, these signals are also present there. But these days, we don't use modem. We only use typically RxD, TXD, and using that you can, and RS-232, your signals can go for 50 feet. But if you take the railway reservation terminal at any center of railway reservation, it uses RS-232. But then if you, let's say, go to a railway reservation counter at Pune, that is actually connected to the system which is at uh, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj terminus at Mumbai. So how does the signal go there? That goes over telephone lines, or they have their internal fiber optic links. So it's a WAN link. So for that, you may use a modem or equivalent of that. So when you are sending it over a long distance, modem may come into picture, but not required when the distance in 50 feet, which will be the case for most of us. So this was the original use, that you could connect two what are called as data uh, telecommunication equipment to, or rather data terminal equipment, to what is called as a data communication equipment, which is a modem. So that is only for academic purpose. So typically you will have a connector which I showed you. In between there will be a chip called MAX232, which will convert the levels from 5 volt to 12 volt. So that is how a simple UART can help us in transmitting and receiving data at the rates like 9600, 19.2K, or if the controllers are good, it can even go up to 115 kilobits per second. So that was the one interface, that is UART. Now let's look at another one called as I2C. So what does I2C stand for? It's actually IIC, which is an integrated circuit bus. So as the name suggests, this is used for connecting two ICs. So what are the typical ICs? A peripheral and a microcontroller. Or a peripheral, two microcontrollers can also be connected using an inter-IC bus. So it is again bidirectional. The previous bus was full duplex because you had a signal called TXD and RXD. But here it is bidirectional. Half duplex means either you can send or you can receive. But there is a clock signal. UART did not have a clock. Here you have a clock. It was defined by Philips long time ago. And as the name suggests, you can connect two ICs with it. So this is intended for short distance within a piece of equipment, which means though today you have hardware available which can take I2C bus out of the box, but its original intention was to connect ICs within an equipment. Let's say you have a ECG machine and inside that you want to have it, or you have an automatic call answering machine. You want to have interconnect the devices inside them. Then you would use I2C bus. So what are the signals? There are only two signals, clock and data. And the original I2C had a rate of 100 kilobits per second. There is a fast mode, high speed mode, and there are few more modes that can be used for even higher data rates. It is a multi-master, meaning there is a provision for having more than one master in a system. I will explain that as we go along. So this is how it looks. Details of the, but what it means is that there are two lines, data and bus, and every master and every slave has connected to it. So what is the purpose of the transistor? The purpose of the transistor is to pull this line low. And what is the purpose of this buffer? So buffer is used for reading and transistor is used for driving. So the transistor when turned on will pull the line low, whereas this buffer will allow the current state of this line, whether high and low, to be read by the I2C controller. So such kind of read and write facility exists both on data line as well as clock line for all the devices. And this type of bus is what is called as open collector bus. And because it is open collector, you need to keep the bus in a idle situation. It's kept at, it's pulled high. So when the no transmission is occurring on the bus, both these lines are high. Okay. So now how does the protocol work? Every node that you connect on this bus can be a master or a slave. Now who can send data? Only master can send data. Who can generate the clock? Only master can generate the clock. Whereas the slave, hello? Anything you want to say? Professor Sharad, are you able to hear me?
Yeah. You are loud and clear.
Okay. No, there was some disturbance I got, so I was wondering whether your voice got broken because I have only screen in front of me. I don't have the other windows, so I am not aware if any questions are asked or something. So if any questions are asked or hand is raised, you can do that. Put your questions in the like you did for the previous sessions in the chat window, and I will answer them in the end because that will keep the continuity of my talk as well as I and more than that I am not able to see the questions that are being asked. So I will defer the questions, but at any point you have a question like for this slide, suppose you have a question, do type in them and I will take the questions in the end. Okay. So I was talking about the I2C protocol. So as we saw in the previous diagram, these are the nodes. So these two are the masters and one is a slave. You can have one master and let's say 5 slaves or 2 masters and 4 slaves. Any such combination is possible. So but master is the one that initiates and terminates the transfer. It also generates the clock. A system can have more than one master as I showed in the previous slide, but only one can be active at a time. Means one would be participating in a transmission. Obviously, the transmission is directed towards one of the slave. It also has got arbitration process, which for paucity of time I will not describe, but just remember that if two masters start driving at the same time, one of them shuts off and the first one continues. So there is a start condition. I will show you what it is in the next slide. After the start condition, it has got 7 bits of address and 1 bits of direction. Now these 7 bits of address are for the slave. So you can have theoretically 127 slaves, but so many may not be present always. And 1 bit tells whether the master is reading or writing. So now there are, let's assume 5 slaves and they have got addresses 1 to 5. The master puts the address number 4, and it says direction bit says reading. So what will happen is the slave number 5 whose address matches will get ready to transmit the data because what master has said is I'm going to read from you. Okay, so this is how it works. So start condition is clock is high, but data line goes low. Data is valid when clock is high, so the data can change. When can data change? Data can change when the clock line goes low. At that time it can change. When the clock is high, it has to be stable. When the clock line is, sorry, this is the clock. When clock is high, data has to be stable. When clock is low, data can change. It may remain high if the next bit is 1. If the next bit is low, it can change here so that when clock again becomes high, the data will be sampled. The start condition is indicated with clock being high, data changing. See the fallacy here, data is not supposed to change here when clock is high, but start and stop conditions violate this. That's how it's known that it is a start condition. That is, the clock is high and the data changes from high to low, or data line changes from low to high, indicating a stop condition when clock is high. So anyway, this is handled by the I2C controller. But why I'm telling you this, using general purpose IO pins, a user can implement an I2C on a GPIO pins. The protocol says that I told you that there is a start condition, 8 data bits. Then there is a in that data bit, 8 data bits. The first byte will contain 7 bits of slave address, followed by 1 bit of direction. And once that is done, once 8 bits are gone, for every 8 bits that are transmitted, the receiver will give an acknowledgement. If the receiver is not in a position to receive the data, it can pause the data flow. How it will do that? It will hold the clock line low. Remember, it's an open collector, so any device can pull it low. Okay, so they are active low. Now, most of the microcontrollers that you get, you have got I2C bus. You have peripherals like RAM, EEPROM, display drivers. Now what is the significance of I2C from the sensor's perspective? Suppose you take a temperature sensor and then you build a small node out of it. How? Let's say by using Atmel 8-bit a 3-pin processor, or not 3, 6-pin processor, or an 8-pin processor, and that processor has got I2C. So using I2C, it will communicate with the external world, and on the other side, using analog port and A to D converter, it may sense a voltage generated by the temperature sensor and send it over I2C. So this tells how exactly the transmission takes place. This is the line, this is the data line for master, this is the data line for the slave. This is how the data line appears on the bus. Clock is always sent by the master. So initially there is a start bit, then there are 7 data bits. Now these 7 data bits correspond to the address because it is the first byte. Then the 8th byte indicates that it is a write operation. Why? Because it's a 0, 0 indicates a write operation. Had it been 1, then it would have been interpreted as read. So what is write indicate? Write indicates that the master is going to send data to the slave. The first byte is sent. The slave all this while was reading the data. Now it writes a 0, indicating what? It has correctly read the byte. Now compare this with a receiving. So in receiving, what happens is master is sending the clock. Who is sending the data? Slave is sending the data. Why? Because it's receiving. So master is sending the clock, it is reading the data that is appearing in the bus. In the 9th bit period, after 8 bits have sent, the master gives an acknowledgement. Why does master give an acknowledgement? Because it is receiving. In the previous case, who was giving the acknowledgement? The slave was giving the acknowledgement. Why? Because master was sending to the slave. So they reverse the role. So a typical communication is like master sends the start then it sends the 7 bits which gives the slave address. Then the 8th bit tells whether it's read and write. The slave acknowledges it. Suppose it is a write transmission. So in the next byte, the byte will be written by the master. Who will give the acknowledgement? Receiver. So it will keep sending the data, and finally there will be a stop bit. Okay. So that is how you combine a set of bytes and make a frame of sending data to the slave or receiving data from the slave. That is how the communication takes place. This is a practical implementation. Inside a TV set, I2C bus is used. So most of the TVs that you get today are intelligent. So they are super intelligent, I would say. They are smart TVs. But if you take a simple TV which you would have bought, let's say 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it would still have a microcontroller and NVRAM to store the configuration. Then video, it is used only as a control bus. Like the user sets some parameters, those parameters will go in the color decoder, sound decoder, video decoder, whether you are using NTSC system, you are using PAL system, sound is Dolby or not. So that is all programmed through a back channel, and the interface used for that is I2C. Moving ahead, let's look at SPI. SPI stands for Serial Peripheral Interface. If I2C was designed by Philips, SPI was designed by Motorola. It is not half duplex like the previous one, it is full duplex. It is not 2-wire, it is 3-wire. It is still synchronous and like it was the case before. So this is not a multi-master bus, it is a single master but multiple slaves. Data rates can go up to 3 megahertz. Now that's what a typical rate is. Nothing prevents you from going higher if your PCB design and the circuit design is appropriately done. Previous one had a clock and data, just 2 lines and ground. Here you have a line called as master ins layout. Obviously this is the line for slave to send data to the master. Then another one is master out slaving. This is the line used by master to send data to one of the slaves. So it is also called as MOSI MISO, that is MOSI master out slave in, or MISO master in slave out. And when do the master and slave know when to sample the data? There is a clock. Clock is given always by the master. Needless to say, select lines may be present if you are using multiple slaves. The simplest form in which a processor can communicate with a peripheral or a device can communicate with a master is this way. Master out sends data out, master in receives the data, clock always sent by the master, and chip select is generated through an IO pin. Okay. What is inside it? Inside there is nothing but an 8-bit register. So how does this operate? The host loads a data byte. Once a data byte is loaded, like in case of UART, 8 clocks are generated. When 8 clocks are generated, 8 bits are transmitted out. So after 8 clocks are generated, the contents of this get transferred to the contents of this register. Now there is a side effect. Because the clock is going and it is clocking the data out from here, it is clocking data in from here, it is clocking data out from here. At the end of 8 clocks, the data is exchanged. Meaning what is here goes here, what is in the peripheral comes to the processor. So even if the processor did not want to read, it gets the byte. So the way it works is, your processor wants to send 8 bits to the peripheral, it loads 8 bits here. 8 clocks are generated, data gets transferred. How will the, suppose instead of write, there is a read operation. How will that happen? What will the processor do is it will load a dummy byte here. When a dummy byte is loaded, dummy byte is transferred, which is ignored. But when reading means what? The data in the SPI register of the peripheral is wanted by the processor. It cannot do a read on its own. What will it do? It will do a write. It will send a dummy byte. But whenever a byte is sent, a byte comes back. So a dummy byte is written, but what it gets is the actual data that it wanted to read. Why SPI has significance? SPI has significance because implementation is extremely easy. Every microcontroller that you get today will have an SPI. How will you use multiple slaves? You will daisy chain them like this. Suppose processor wants to send data to A, it will load a byte and then it will be sent out to A. Contents of A will go to B, B will go to C, but they will be ignored. Okay. If processor wants to write data to B, what it will do? It will write the byte followed by a dummy byte. So the first byte
Ashish ji, I think you got muted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the screen visible?
Yes, it is visible and you are audible also.
When I hope this was the slide which was heard properly. So I will move over to the next slide. The difference between this slide, this arrangement, and the arrangement in the next slide is as follows. Here you are daisy chaining, which means you just need two pins, MOSI and MISO, but then you have an overhead of transmitting the data multiple times if you have to send it to one hop away. Hence, what we do is we do this arrangement wherein the MOSI MISO pins on slaves are connected in parallel, but then you need additional pins to select one device at a time. So the hardware designer would choose one of these methods, and the software writer has to comply with what the hardware designer has done, either by sending dummy bytes or in one shot in 8 clocks the data is exchanged by, but then the overhead is of having a select line. So this is how the basic thing works. There is a clock generator. The data is loaded parallelly but shifted out serially. Only 8 clocks are sent. Precisely 8 clocks are sent, at the end of which the data between this shift register and the shift register on the other side gets exchanged. So the data transfer takes place using a master-slave relationship. The master will always initiate the data frame. How does it initiate the data frame? It generates a clock and selects a slave device, assuming that we have a slave select. So data is transferred in one direction for sure. The side effect is that it can be transferred in both directions simultaneously, because whether you like it or not, transfer takes place in both directions. You cannot say I'm only transmit the data. When you transmit the data, a byte comes back. So if you are implementing a transmission only, then the received byte must be discarded. If if you are wanting to read the data, then you send a dummy byte. Okay, that is the way it works. Okay, so may look little complex, but the simplest the USP of SPI lies in it being very simple to implement from the hardware's perspective. So this is an example how one would connect a real-time clock to a microcontroller. You can replace the real-time clock with a with some sensor which can have a, let's say, an SPI interface if it has it. With a many sensors have got a built-in microcontroller to make their connectivity simple. Then the advantage of this is that you will directly get the digital output even if your sensor itself is generating the analog output. So here you can see that the two signals are connected, clock is connected, and select is connected, because otherwise the device can go into a sort of a uh, low low power state, and when you select it, it can wake up and then get ready for transmission of data. So this is one example of uh, using SPI. Connection is done between a peripheral and a host. The next topic for us to look at is controller area network. So CAN bus was developed by Bosch. That's a company that used to make uh, devices for automobiles, and it was designed particularly to meet the needs of in-vehicle data transfer. If you look at the earliest automobile, like let's say Model T, which was made by Ford, it was an electromechanical device. As you know, the basic principle of an IC engine is that there are multiple strokes, and in one of the strokes, the which is given by a coil. So it's an electromechanical device, essentially generating a spark at the right time, and then that cycle is self-sustaining, and you convert the reciprocating motion into a circular motion, and the vehicle moves. Over a period of time, this basic principle was improved because electronics started getting into vehicles. Many of you would be aware that there is a embedded system called as ECU, engine control unit, which precisely decides when the spark should be lit, so that the uh, fuel is entirely burnt, leaving no residue. Thus, the emissions are reduced. Today, the focus is on emission. Like you may be aware that Bharat Stage 4, Bharat Stage 6, BS6, these are the standards that are being used. You may also be aware of the Volkswagen scandal, wherein when they were get given the automobile for testing for emission, they tweaked the engine control unit software in such a way that the emissions were low, but when emissions were low, the mileage was not good. So when they started selling, they tweaked the software in such a way that the emissions were high, but the mileage was good. So this was all done inside the ECU. And the reason I'm telling you this is because electronics started when it started invading in the uh, electromechanical device like a car, there was a need felt for transferring the data from various nodes that are present inside the car. So why did they not use the existing standard like RS-232 or anything that existed at that time? Why were they wanted to define a new standard? That's because one reason is it the electronic controls in the car started increasing. And if you look at the advertisement made by MG Hector, they say that it's an internet car, meaning not only it's transmitting information within itself, but it is also connected to internet, and you do a lot of things sitting at home in your car, or communicate with the manufacturer, or manufacturer can see whether the parts are working fine. So it opens up a lot of possibilities. So you had a need for transmitting data between various nodes inside the car because it started getting intelligent, beginning with ECU. But this transmission was not like what RS-232 can do because it was operating in an electromagnetically hostile conditions, in the sense that there are too many EMI, EMC interference that are happening, and the number of loads started getting larger. So you not just 2 or 3, but maybe 20, 30 of them, or 50, 60 of them. And then this has to be with high reliability in a condition which is not conducive for error-free transmission. So not just CAN, but quite a few standards were developed, but CAN emerged as front runner because it was adopted and it had some good properties which were good for automobile to adopt it. So this shows the various places where the colored nodes that you see are where the uh, CAN nodes are present. And by the way, this is a left-hand drive car, so you find it on the left side of it. In Indian car, it may be all this bus may be running on the right side of the car. So what are the features? So it's an asynchronous. You better not have a clock in a hostile condition. So it's asynchronous with fixed bit rate for a given system. So remember the philosophy of design. This CAN bus, which is put in this, let's say, assume that this is a Mercedes car, and it has a CAN bus inside that. Then this CAN bus is a self-contained bus, meaning that it is not like an Ethernet bus, wherein an Ethernet-based server is talking to an Ethernet-based desktop. It's not like that. It's not a universal standard. It is a standard, but it's being implemented in a given car. If the model changes, you may have the data rate running at 2 Mbps maybe, or 500 kbps, because it is confined to this kind of a model. Okay, so that is very important, that for a given system means you implement it. It may be, let's say you implement it for an elevator, then for that elevator of 10th floor, it is fixed or it is implemented for that situation. It is a half duplex with peer-to-peer communication, meaning any device can send data to anything. Physical interconnect not defined by the standard, and what you call as 1 and 0 is called as recessive or dominant, meaning dominant is 0, recessive is 1. Multiple, any device can start transmitting, but then in that case arbitration is applied. There is a high level of security. I will not get into that, but because electronically hostile situation, so exhaustive error checking is there, which I will not be describing. So it's like this. If you look at the OSI model, then it's a closed network. Okay, it's not like Ethernet. So there is nothing like security sessions, logins, which exist in a OSI model, wherein you have you start with a presentation and all those layers are not required. No user interface requirements. But what is important is nodes should be able to exchange information with minimal fuss. That is what is there. So the data link layer and the physical layer is implemented in the chip, whereas the application layer is implemented in a microcontroller. So a typical CAN node will have a CAN transceiver and it will have a CAN controller, which will have the intelligence of the microcontroller, which will filter out the messages, take action on the messages, etc. So typical device will look like a CAN bus, which will be terminating resistors at the end, a transceiver, which will which will have an impedance. Yesterday the question was asked, how many nodes you can put? So my answer was 32. That is because this transceiver's output impedance is such that it it is sum total of 32 input impedances of a similar transceiver which are connected on the bus. It can be 64, or I was looking at some literature. Analog devices have transceivers that can even go higher. So it all depends upon, then of course their current consumption will also be higher. The length of the cable, etc. Everything comes into picture. But remember the situation that you implement CAN bus for a given situation. It is not a generic thing that you take one node from one manufacturer, another for another, and you just keep expanding the node or scaling up. It doesn't happen like that. So it's a multi-drop bus. So topology with resistor at both ends, as I showed you, and typical number is 32 to 64. If you want to go higher number, you can put bridges or repeaters. So now how does it communicate? So there are messages that flow over the network. It doesn't tell what the contents of message are. It only says that you have a message. Each node can send a message. Now the protocol says, so what we are trying to say here is that I am not sure if you will be, I will be able to make you understand in the short time that I have. But look at it this way, that it gives you a mechanism for exchanging messages. Now a user can define a message in a car. Let's say you take a car by Mercedes and you are implementing the CAN protocol in it. Then there will be a message called message number 1. Now when you say message number 1, everybody will know that message number 1 is engine temperature. So if a message number 1 appears on the bus, it means that it contains the temperature of the engine. Suppose there is message number 5. Everybody knows that message number 5 means that the car is turning right. Now who should use this message will depend upon the filters that are set on every node. I'm not sure whether I'm able to drive this point home, but it is unlike Ethernet. In Ethernet, there will be a source ID, destination ID, and it's very clear the packet is going from source to destination. That is not the case here. It's a broadcast. Yesterday, like it was said, it was a broadcast bus. So now if the message number 1, which says that engine temperature is 40 degrees, it's very clear that the dashboard is not generating this message, but the ECU is generating the message. And this message has no significance to anti-skid braking system, but it has definitely a significance to the dashboard controller, because it will show this number on the dashboard and the user can see it. So the significance of the contents of the message is determined by the message number rather than Okay, so it is, as I mentioned, it is a broadcast based mechanism. It is a message oriented protocol. It is nothing to do with the station names and addresses. It's not there as a part of the message. But what is done is, as a designer, he will define 01 is engine temperature, 05 car turning red, 0 whatever, 0A is a message for, let's say, uh, something related to anti-skid braking system. Another is related to the car getting the sensor which is related to crash is getting activated. So all this is defined for a given system by the designer of the CAN system which is going to be used. So how does it work? I'll just describe this using a diagram. So the link is in recessive state. There is a start of frame very similar to what we saw in UART. This is the message ID, which is also used for arbitration. Means every message is unique, and lower the number here, without getting into detail, lower the number of the message number which appears in the arbitration field, higher is the priority. Then there is a control field which tells how many bytes in the data field. There is a CRC and acknowledgement and enter frame space. So what are the types of frame you can use? You can send a data frame, which is actually, I give you example, uh, in which the arbitration field we have number 01, which is the message ID. This data field have a number. The number will represent 45.6. What is that? That is sending the data. What is that data? Data is uh, the engine temperature. Why is it engine temperature? Because this field said that it is the number is 0. The number is as I mentioned 01. So now this is an identifier. Yesterday there was a question about identifier. How many bits? Typically it is 11 bit, but one of the bits can indicate that it is a longer identifier. So if there are some implementation where 11 bits are not sufficient, so you want to go for 29 bit. So again, I will not get into those complications. For time being, let us assume that it is a standard 11 bit identifier. So data frame is, example is engine temperature is 40 degrees. What is remote frame? Remote frame does not contain information, but it contains a question saying that there could be a question saying that if the message number is 25, it may be a remote frame saying that the dashboard controller generated that remote frame saying that it wants to know the engine temperature. It's a message. I want to know the engine temperature. Message number is 25. This is received by the ECU. What does ECU do? It sends a data frame with ID equal to 1. What is ID equal to 1? Current engine temperature. Error frame, that is sent when error is detected. So normally there will be data frames and remote frames traveling on the network. If an error is seen because of some reason, error frames are generated by the device which sees the error. If the frames are coming too fast, then the receiver node can insert overload frames to make sure that there is an extra delay between the data frames. Okay, so this is a very basic way in which I have told about CAN. I mean, you can have a 3 lecture or 4 lecture series on CAN itself because it's pretty complex. Now coming to the application layer, which I had shown in this diagram, the application layer, what does it have? It has what is called as a object layer and a transfer layer. Okay, what I described to you till now was the physical layer. Okay, physical layer and the transfer layer. The object layer is the one wherein the messages are handled, messages are filtered, and then from there it goes to the layer above it. Let's suppose it's a dashboard, then there would be a display in which the information is displayed. So the standard says that it talks about the transfer layer itself, like what I described to you was about this physical layer. You could use unshielded twisted pair, you could shielded twisted pair, any such cable, and the object layer is where the microcontroller takes part in deciding which messages are to be handled by this node, which messages are to be generated by this node. Now, if you look at the physical layer, you will find that you take Atmel AVR, you take microchip PIC controllers, you take ARM processor, they will have CAN chips. Almost all microcontroller will have a CAN controller. If they do not have CAN controller, you can take a CAN controller externally like Siemens 505 or SJ11 1000 or SJ1100. These are the controllers. These are the transceivers, individual chips. But you get a standard architecture like 8051 with built-in CAN controller. Or Siemens has got 8051 based a controller with CAN controller. So to build a node, you will need a microcontroller, a CAN controller, and a transceiver. So a transceiver, a CAN controller, and a microcontroller. Most of the time, you will have a chip with CAN and microcontroller like this. All you need to add is external transceiver, and your node is created. Why is CAN bus popular? First reason is it can identify the errors, and the nodes which are causing trouble can be secluded. Okay, they can automatically disconnect. Reliability is the key here. So though it started with car, but factory automation, marine, medical, scientific devices, many of them use CAN bus internally. So cars, then buses, trucks, ships, aircrafts, lifts, building automation, medical equipment is where CAN bus is used. So that completes our discussion about CAN. The last thing is we are describing is Ethernet before we talk about sensors. So when you describe networks or networking protocols or networking, they are generally classified into local area and wide area. So what is local area? As the name suggests, you have a limited distance and the number of nodes are also less, let's say a few hundred, and Ethernet will be used to connect a LAN, and that's the most, I think 99 maybe percent of local area networks that are used in the world today would be Ethernet. That's the popularity of Ethernet. Wide area network, like an internet, is a wide area network. So you will use WAN links, like you will have a fiber optic link or a telephone link or a DSL link. So those are the wide network. So local area networks are the building blocks. So like let's say you have in your college, you have let's say 5 departments. Each department has so 5 labs. So one network in each lab. So 25 such networks. They all can communicate with the external world using WAN link. So that's the kind of hierarchical thing you will have. 5 buildings, each building having 5 floors, and like you have a router in each building and all 5 buildings connected and one gateway to the through WAN. So that's kind of hierarchical network you can build using LANs locally and then reach out using a WAN topology or a WAN kind of connectivity. So LAN was devised earlier. RS2 before Ethernet came in, the only network that was available was RS232, and I showed you that a TX is connected to RX. So you have a point-to-point link in RS232. So that is how LAN came in, and there was a bus-based LAN. I will tell that again, and you could connect host. So the word host is used in LAN as a node, as a desktop or as a computer. Today, Ethernet is not just limited to desktops, but Ethernet, both wired and wireless, can be used for connecting nodes like your IoT nodes or any such node. Okay, so what we do is we first look at topology, how they are connected. Okay, so topology, definition of topology is the shape or the physical connectivity. So why do you have topology? You will have an aim that it should be able to take the traffic through least cost path. Cost is not in terms of money, but time, how you can reach them fast and how you can give the lowest latency and highest bandwidth. So that is how topology is defined, and that's not my aim, but just for sake of completeness, you can have a bus topology. That is what traditional Ethernet, original Ethernet used. Star is what the Ethernet uses today. Ring is what IBM token ring used, and network where you have multiple paths to reach. Like if you want to reach from A to E, you can go via B or you can go via C. So let's say ACE is the least cost path, shortest path, but if it fails, let's say EC link fails, then it can be routed through ABE. So each topology has got its advantages and disadvantages when you weigh it on attributes of bandwidth, response time or travel time, and the redundancy. So why Ethernet? Because there were ArcNet, Token Ring, so many of them came. But this 85 is, I think, a very conservative estimate. I feel that it could be something like over 90 or 95%. Okay. So why Ethernet is popular? Because it started with 10 megabits per second. It graduated to 100, then 1G, 10G, 40G, 100G, 200G is also there. But of course, for desktop, 1G is good. The cheapest thing you can today, you got printers with Ethernet. Every device that you have that you can have being used in your office or home, you can have Ethernet built into it. And it is so pervasive, it is so popular that anybody who makes a device, it easily operates, and the scalability is unmatched. You can add 100 nodes. If that takes away the capacity of the switch, add another 100, put a router. So you can, I mean, it's theoretically you can scale it up as much as you want. Okay. So when you say Ethernet by means of standard, it is like 802.3. So original protocol was CSMA-CD, that is carrier sense, means before transmission look for carrier. If carrier is present on the bus, that means somebody is transmitting, so wait. Why wait? Because it's a multiple access, it's a bus topology. So multiple devices can access. And it can so happen that the link is idle. Two devices get ready. Each one of them checks, finds no carrier, so starts transmitting. But then because they started transmitting together, there was a collision. So there has to be provision for detection of collision. How do you recover from collision? There is an algorithm which I don't think I can cover because of paucity of time. But it has it started off with 802.3. Then again, I will not get into details, but if you notice here, 10 became 100 over a period of time, and today you have standard defined for 400 gigabits per second. That's quite huge leap when you started with 10 Mbps in the early 70s. But that is the good thing about Ethernet, that it is evolving and it is backward compatible. So Robert Metcalfe, when he was working at Palo Alto's Xerox lab, he made a Aloha network, Alto Aloha network, and he called it Ethernet because he felt that he had a vision that uh, I'm not sure some of you would know that there is a theory which says that the universe is full of luminiferous ether. So that is because when you want to describe the dual nature of light, how it reaches from sun to earth, uh, we say that a medium is required, and that media is called as luminiferous ether. And Bob felt that it's going so pervasive that it will reach universe, so he called it Ethernet. How the standard came in, Xerox, Digital and Intel came together. So it is called as DICS 1.0, and uh, later IEEE adopted it. Okay, so where does it lie? This is your standard OSI model, physical data link network, transport session, presentation, application, 7-layer model. So Ethernet sits at the data link layer, and so it has got part of physical layer and part of data link layer. So that is where it is. So it defines the twisted pair, a thick Ethernet, thin Ethernet as the medium, and then you have a mechanism to access the medium, and then there is a logical link control. So that's the part of the data link layer. So this is a bus topology. The original Ethernet had a single backbone cable on which transceivers were put, the links were terminated, and a node could be connected. The bad thing about it is any short anywhere or any break anywhere brings the entire network down. Thus, the star topology came in. Now there are two ways you can connect star. One is called as a hub, another is called as a switch. Okay. So now originally hub came in. So hub is same as this in the sense that it uses the shared medium. So if C1 is talking to C2, C3 and C4 have to be silent, or C2 is talking to C3, C1, C4 have to be silent, because hub is nothing but a collapsed backbone. Okay. Star network is good because there is an individual connection between hub and the, though this shows a logical topology, physical topology is C1 to hub, C2 to hub, C3 to hub, and so on. Advantage of this over bus, any problem anywhere, whole thing goes down. If C1 has a problem, this link has a problem, only C1 goes down. Okay, but cabling required is more. Scalability is an issue there. You can just keep remove the terminator, keep adding segments. Okay. So star topology with Ethernet switch is what is followed today, and gigabit is the lowest possible denominator today because things have become so cheap that for desktop gigabit is used. For IoT and other things 10 and 100 Mbps is what is used. So a typical frame looks like this, that there is a preamble, then there is a destination address, then there is a source address, then the MAC address, the actual data, and that is how the bits are sent. Again, this is only for academic purpose because the controller handles all this. You as a user has to give just a packet. Okay. So without going into much details, I think you can read this later. What are the definitions for this? Preamble, I'll tell you, is something that from idle, you to get into the, to latch on to the incoming bit stream, you need to have a preamble. So there are ones and zeros. If you notice here, the clock, the data keeps ticking between 1 and 0. Thus, the receiver is able to use what is called as phase lock loop, PLL, or a version of that is called as DLL, which is digital in nature. So it's able to latch on the packet. Okay, so the data field can be up to 1500 bytes. The minimum it can have, the Ethernet packet can be minimum, it has to be 64 bytes, out of which 48 is the data. So if you are sending 1 byte, then you will pad it up with 47 more bytes, and then frame check sequence is the CRC that checks the validity of the data at the receiving end. Okay. This is another important thing with Ethernet. Every device in the world has to have a unique MAC address, and that MAC address is 48-bit. And there are some protocols that like ARP and RARP in TCP/IP which work on MAC addresses to TCP/IP address conversion. So this contains 24-bit, which is unique to a manufacturer, and next 24 bits are assigned by the manufacturer. Like CDAC is a member of this IEEE standard. So we applied for a MAC ID. So any product that CDAC makes and uses Ethernet in it, it will have a MAC address beginning with 00A022. And this is a running number. Suppose first product that we make will have 0001, next one will have 2. So we have to keep a record of how many IDs were given out, and next one in the series is always given out when a new one is made. Okay. So this allows, see, I told you that on bus it is half duplex, but with star topology, you can have full duplex. So when you have full duplex, CSMA CD is not required because there is a point-to-point communication between the switch and the device. So that is an important improvement, because you can have, if you have a switch, if you have a hub, then when C1 is talking to C2, C3, C4 cannot talk. But if it's a switch, C1 can send data to C2, C3 can send data to C4, because there is a anyway a star topology, as well as the connectivity is point to point. Or if there are 24 nodes connected, you can have 12 pairs of combination if it is a switch instead of a hub. Okay, so that is what we are talking in full duplex mode. So 10BASE-T and all others, they all support full duplex mode. So here is an example how when you have a node, like if let's assume this is a connector on a Raspberry Pi, then it is capable of 10, 100 or 1 gig. So typically the cord that you use has a one-to-one connection. But suppose this is connected on one side, it is a device, another side it is a switch. But suppose you are connecting two devices back to back, then you would need a cross cable. Okay, so keep in mind what cable, whether you are using the right cable. In 90% of the cases, when you are connecting a device to a Ethernet switch, 1:1 cable, a patch cord is used. But in rare situations, let's say you want to connect two Raspberry Pis back to back, or connect Arduino to Raspberry Pi without a switch in between, then you would need a cross cable, unless there is a mechanism to cross it over in the device itself. So I will not confuse you, but 90% of the cases it is a 1:1 cable, and you can see it. This is transparent, so you can see these colors physically. Like these colors can be seen on both sides. If you match, they are on the same order, you would know that it's a 1:1 cable. So Ethernet equipment, what it is: host, which contains network interface card; hubs, which are nothing but a collapsed backbone; and a switch, which gives a point-to-point connectivity. Okay, so again, I will not get into the details of this. I think you can read it. Basically, I will explain this diagram where there is a host, there is a device driver. Suppose this is a Ethernet controller in the Raspberry Pi. The driver will put the packets in the TX. This engine will send it out. Whatever comes in will be delivered in the received descriptors, and the device driver will pick it up. That's how the Ethernet controller is viewed by the host. Okay. In case of switch, it's nothing but a crossbar. What is a crossbar? Like a telephone switch is a crossbar. It makes connections. So does Ethernet. So you have, let's say, a switch with 8 ports, and there are 8 devices connected. Then it will allow any device to talk to any other device. Okay, so it's like a making connections. I will again not get into the details of this. But before finishing the description about Ethernet, what's happening here is that from 10G, I already told you we are gone up to 400G. And virtual LANs, again, I will not get into details. You can group the devices together in a switch and make them one logical connection. So last topic for me to explain is sensors. So now you would say that I have talked more about the interfaces, but the reason I told you, like you can have 2 or 3 lectures just dedicated to sensor, but then depending upon your application, right from agriculture to smart building, the same sensors can be adopted, or this a group of sensors can be used for one application and another group for another application. So what is the criteria one uses for choosing a sensor? It begins with accuracy. So what is the resolution you want? How close uh, is the precision that you want? Like if you are using it for comfort air conditioning, then whether it is 23 or 24, it does not matter so much. But if you are checking the temperature of a furnace, then you need to know to the 2 decimals, because your PID controller will work at a very precise level. So accuracy is very important. Then what is a range? Whether it is only 30 to 40, like if it's a temperature of a human being that is measured, the range will be limited. But if you are measuring the temperature, ambient temperature, the range will be more. Where should it work? Should it work in-house, or it's exposed to external conditions? Then reliability, how long? Like today in the morning, it was told that batteries may last few years. If they can last few years, then your sensor should also last for few years, because you're not going to change them. Sometimes, are you going to use it in harsh conditions, or are you going to make it rugged, like drop protected, and there is an IP standards, yeah, are you going to use in them? Then obviously cost is going to be high. Size and weight, it's going to be a part of another equipment. So what is your budget for size, weight, and power? In the morning, Professor Sharad mentioned about that. How much power can you spare for the sensor? Is it battery operated? And finally, trade-offs, in the sense that are you just taking the sensor, along with you are taking the device that converts it from analog to digital, makes packets and send it over a network. And last but not the least, It's a cost because you are going to make hundreds of nodes. Every penny that you save on one sensor is going to multiply into number of devices that you are going to use. So these are some of the commonly used sensors. Again, in temperature, there will be 5 varieties. There is an RTD, or how you are going to use it, what purpose it is being used for. Is it used for agricultural? Is it for greenhouse? Are you going to sense temperature below the surface of Earth? So again, that's why I said that if you really want to do justice to sensors, it's a big, one can write a book on it, in fact. Then humidity, that's another one that's commonly used in smart cities and for predicting things. Atmospheric pressure, so temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure. This is typically that you use when you are that's when you are uh, using it indoors and outdoors and checking few things or making the environment conducive to human beings, or collecting data over a period of time to predict the future climate or something. Then water quality, like in smart cities, this is one of the popularly used sensors to know the turbidity. There are various things that you can check, like just lying here. I'm not sure whether you can see it, but this is Xiaomi has made it for home use. It's a sensor that I think it's not visible here, but there is a sensor here and it can tell you what is the ppm of suspended impurities in it. So this is like it's like a equivalent of, let's say, a thermometer that you can use to check a temperature of a human being. This can you can use it for checking the turbidity that is described here before you drink water at home. So water level, this is used for controlling supplying water to a area and all. Proximity sensors, this is used for smart buildings. You turn on the lights when somebody enters. Then you light intensity, you can use it to let's say in this room you can see there it may be evident there are some LED bulbs or LED panels. How much should be the how much should be its intensity can be decided by the ambient one. Motion and gyroscope, these are used in moving equipment to know the tilt and few more things in a car, to know whether there is a sudden jerk. That is also done by the accelerometer. Then there are CCD sensors, which if you want to put more intelligence. Then gas sensors, again, they use chemistry to know what gas it is, smoke for detecting fire, and whole lot of chemical sensors. So again, I admit that I just made a passing reference to sensors. The reason being that itself is in a huge topic, and I think it should be driven. The sensor should be driven, like if you are doing a case study, then one it may make sense to go in depth of the sensor that are being used in that case study. What is the native way in which they transmit the data, analog or digital? Then what is how you can pack it to be sent into an IoT network? So all that things will come up when you take a case study. Otherwise, it is not possible to do justice to sensors. Okay, so I overshot by 10 minutes. Sorry about that. So this is what we saw today in 1.5 hours. That serial buses, they are used for communication. Inside the box, you would use typically I2C and SPI. Outside the box or outside the node, you would use CAN and Ethernet. We saw that how the data rate varies based on that, the distance varies, and there are many other things, whether like powered, non-powered, etc. And we only talked about wired networks, a whole lot of wireless networks starting from Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, Li-Fi, and so many others exist, one which can be used. Coming to the sensors, choice of sensor is determined by the application. Wide choice is available based on the attributes that are described. You can choose one, and you can just use the sensor if you already have the embedded system, or you can embed a sensor in an intelligent system to transmit data in a wired or wireless manner in a digital way. That is all I have. I am not going to talk about USB because that was anyway an optional thing. But I'll just I wanted to show you the thank you slide, but that's it. And my email address is ashishk@cdac.in. So in case anybody wants to communicate with me, you can reach me at this address. So in the slides that I give, I will put that thank you slide on which my address would be available. So I am open to questions. So I will stop the slide so that I can see the chat box. And if you are not hungry, you would have posted some questions.
So there is a hand raised by V Mahalakshmi. So
So will
you
she?
can.
Yeah. Either way, you can unmute yourself or. Okay, in the Vega processor that CDAC has developed, it's an embedded, but I am not sure Wi-Fi is there or not, but SPI I2C are definitely there. I will check and I mean, if you can send me an email, I will share with you its brochure, and then I will be able to give you the exact details of that. But Wi-Fi may not be there. I'm not too sure of Wi-Fi, but I2C, SPI, and all those interfaces that help you to connect devices on the PCB itself, they will definitely be there. Is it good to use fusion sensors? Sorry, madam, I have zero idea about fusion sensors. Sharadji, do you know what are fusion sensors? You are, I think,
The, the thing that she is referring to is an inertial measurement unit, the IMU sensor,
okay.
which would have a gyroscope, it would have a gimbal, and a few other things.
Okay,
So,
okay. I think that's good. I mean, I thought it's used for some nuclear fusion or something. So no, it's not that. It is just you have fused multiple sensors into one. I think that's what it refers to. So yes, I think yes, you can use it. Just see what interface it offers. Most likely, if you have multiple sensors, then it would have a digital interface like SPI I2C or something like that, and you would need a microcontroller to get that information and send it further using Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or something. So that may be a good to make an intelligent node. Okay, has any steps been taken to introduce Vega or Shanti? You meant Shakti, I guess, in curriculum. So IIT Madras might have, Professor Kamakoti might have put that in the curriculum. We will check that out. But that's a good suggestion. Vega, I think I will tell my team, um, uh, the head of the Vega team. This is a good suggestion. I thank Professor Shrikant for it. I will see how they can make a curriculum out of it, so that at least an indigenously developed processor is taught in Indian curriculum. How good are Texas CC2560? They are good. I mean, very fact that they are costly, they are good. But CC2560, I think it's a board, if I'm not mistaken. It's a complete board. So yes, please use it. I mean, in lab you should make them. I mean, give it to students. Here, I mean, since we are talking about IoT, I will, and we are talking about sensors or too many things. I would just caution you all when you give it to students, just sensitize them about not touching the exposed pins or something, especially in the month of dry weather. Your body generates, you may not be aware, but 1.5 kV of voltage, and the worst part is if it goes through one of these pins, it may permanently damage it. Now the worst part is this device may not be dead. It will work intermittently, and intermittent problems are the worst ones to debug. So make sure that you if students are using it, put them in appropriate case like acrylic case or something, or sensitize them, or don't keep it on a surface which is conductive. Make sure that the surface on which you put it is has insulation, because especially these things are not taught in curriculum, that these are very these devices are sensitive to ESD, especially in this during this period of dry weather. Okay, ARM academically provide netlist to implement on FPGA. Yes, I think one of the sessions on ARM, I guess they will tell about it. Right, Professor Sharan?
No, I think the question is whether Vega is open source or not, so that they can use it to implement on FPGAs.
Okay, okay. Like okay, ARM. Okay. Yeah,
Like
yeah, I will that. So, Ranga Babu sir, please mail me. My email address has been put in the chat box. So please mail me, and then I will get that answer for you. Okay. So we had I think there was one competition that was announced some time ago, wherein these kits, Xilinx kits were given on which this Vega processor could have been implemented, and the competition was adding a peripheral, external peripheral, and making it implement inside an FPGA kit. And they had invited ideas, and the good ideas were shortlisted, and they were given a free kit by Xilinx. So I'm sure you get at what level, is it at netlist level, or it's a soft macro, or what it is. I may not be able to tell offhand, but there is a mechanism by which an external devices can be combined with Vega, and they can be I mean put together in one silicon like an FPGA. At the moment it is FPGA, but they are uh, soon that ASIC version will also come out, I think maybe in a year's time. All right. Any more questions? I think the good thing about such kind of online things with your video office, you could be eating also if you're feeling hungry. But that liberty is not there for the organizer and the lecturer, who have to show their face. I'm just kidding. Go ahead. Please ask questions if any. Okay. Not.
so, maybe Ashish ji, if you are aware of any good reference book or something for these protocols, book or any material that you can let me know. I can share over email also.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
it's there.
Pranav wants to ask the question. Go ahead, Pranav. So we already got an answer. It's not there in academic textbooks, so it will be very difficult. I will have to also search. I just
Uh,
got a
Good evening, sir. Are you able to hear me?
yes, Pranav.
Very good evening, sir. Thanks for the informative session. Sir, I would like to ask if I want, most of the times I've heard when it comes to IoT, we are connecting the non-computational devices over the internet, like umbrella, oven. I heard such kind of examples. Let's say I have an umbrella that I want to connect over the internet, and which will give some basic details to the user that take me with you. Today we have a higher instance. So if such kind of implementation I want to make it, or if let's say if I want to make it smart mirror, which gives the some basic weather forecast to the user prior he leaves from his home. So when I want to create such kind of devices, whatever the minimum hardware or whatever the minimum uh, things that I require, or in a more better way, I will ask how I will assign a IP address to a non-computational device. What is the minimum requirement?
Okay, so I mean, I think uh, it's let me answer your question in this way. In the there are two parts to your question. That is, one is like you take the example of umbrella, and let us say uh, you have uh, you have a smartphone with you, and let us assume that you will not forget to carry a smartphone. The question is whether if there is a mechanism by which while you are leaving your house, the smartphone tells you that you should carry an umbrella. If let's say this is your use case, then it can be done in a simple way, like you can have what is called as RFID tag is one thing. So you don't need the umbrella to be intelligent, but you need to make sure that the umbrella is in proximity of you when going. So in that case, you can put an RFID. Or there is one more thing that is available in smartphones. I'm not sure if it's on all smartphones, but most of it have it. That is called as NFC. So there are like RFID, there are NFC tags. So you can put NFC tags, and in a such a way that while you are those NFC tags trigger your mobile phone while you are leaving the house. So there could be NFC tags. You put NFC tags in your car. You can put NFC tags at your door. So at that time you get an alert, and one of the easiest things without anything, even the umbrella being just a plain umbrella, what you can do is it can just alert your mobile phone gave an alert saying that have you carried the umbrella. It may not be able to figure out whether you are carrying the umbrella. It will be able to detect if you are carrying an umbrella if there is an tag that is attached to the attached to the umbrella, and there is a mechanism to read it from your phone. That is one way. Now coming to giving other question that you had of giving an IP address to a non-computing device. So now you take the example of umbrella, and suppose the requirement is that don't ask why the requirement is like this. The requirement is that you need to know whether the umbrella is open or closed. Okay, so that is the requirement. So which means that this, and you as a result you want to talk to this umbrella and you want to give it an IP address. So now the only way you can do it is one of the ways you can do it is let's say you take a node like that the ESP, some number is there, I forgot the number, 8422 or something, which is node MCU. So you take a node MCU with a battery, you put it in the inside the umbrella, and when you open it, there is a switch which opens up, or if you close it, that limit switch is pushed, and it knows that the umbrella is closed. So now this umbrella itself cannot get an IP address, but the node MCU that you connected to it has the ability to be given an IP address. And the only way to give an IP address to a non-computing device is to put a smallest possible connected device onto it. Okay, Sharadji, you can add more to it.
No, I think you have answered that question in sufficient detail. So it's good.
I can't, for some reason, I can't see any on my screen. I can't see any chat. Okay, there is one thing.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, you're welcome.
So any more question? Okay, then on behalf of IIT Goa, myself, and all the participants here, I would like to thank Mr. Ashish Kuilkar for his nice informative session. There were sufficient detail for everyone to get interested about the different different protocols, interface protocols, and learn more about them. Typically, as one of you mentioned, it's not so easy to find all this information in usual course textbooks. So it was quite informative for everyone. So thank you again, Ashish ji, for the session. And please send me your slides so that I can send them by today evening.
Sure.
And the next session will begin at 2:30. Please use the link that I have already sent in the email. So we will rejoin at 2:30. And yeah, so all of you have some lunch, and then we will. So maybe Ashish, there is just one more question. You can take this. Do you think for UG students, and then we close.
Do you think for UG students application level understanding is useful or device driver level is useful? See, it's like this, that what is the aim? if I mean, and it also depends upon what student. If he's from information technology or computer science, then I think application level understanding it will be good. But suppose he's an you need like CDAC organizations like CDAC which develop the entire thing like full stack. They need people who understand device driver level. So and it can be best understood by a student who is good at electronics, not just the computer science. So device driver level has to be understood by a certain class of people who do system level programming. So this is a niche area. So not you will not find too many openings for device driver kind of thing. But if somebody has it, that will definitely be an advantage. But at the same time, I would caution that the person should have the enough knowledge about how the hardware functions, like device selects and things like that. So that he has to appreciate and understand. Okay?
Okay. So yeah, I think as Ashish ji mentioned, it is important for the students to understand the system at different levels. They need not be experts at each and every level, but at least that understanding should be there so that they get to appreciate how things function, and only then they can, implement and design, implement such protocols in real systems.
Perfect.
So then we will close this session, Ashish ji. Thanks once again, and all of you. We will meet at 2:30 for the next session. So take care,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thanks.